Good afternoon. Welcome to today's Zaremski lecture. We want to thank Miles and Elena Zaremski for their generous support for this lecture series. We've had quite a number of excellent lectures throughout the academic year. You will be able to get CLE credit for attending this program. I will show a CLE slide at the very end. We want to lure you into staying with us. And I believe that in the chat, you will have a link to the evaluation form that you need to fill out. So look at the chat. We are very privileged to have with us Professor Maxwell Mehlman. He is a distinguished university professor, which is the highest honor that the university bestows. He's also the Arthur E. Peter Silge Professor of Law. He's a professor in the Department of Bioethics and a co-director, along with me, of the Law Medicine Center. Please place your questions in the Q&A. We will not be able to keep track of the chat, but Q&A, I will look at those at the end. And Professor Mehlman is going to be talking about military use of biomedical performance enhancements, ethical, legal, and policy concerns. So we are looking forward to that.
Thank you, Sharona. I'm going to share my screen now. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, good. So thank you very much, Sharona, again. Welcome, everybody. In December, you may have seen press reports that both China and France are working to create biomedically enhanced soldiers. Now, the military has always wanted to improve the physical and mental capabilities of troops. After all, that's a primary purpose of training, for example, to take the person on the left and make them the person on the right. And the use of biomedical enhancements is certainly not new. Some, for example, say that one of the reasons that the Union won the Civil War was that its soldiers had access to caffeine and coffee, while thanks to the Union blockade, Confederate troops didn't. Amphetamines are one of the enhancements of choice. They were widely administered to American, German, British, and other forces in World War II, and again to U.S. service members in Korea, Vietnam, and the wars in Kuwait, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In Vietnam, there are reports that there were bowls of amphetamine capsules in pilot ready rooms. They could just take a handful. In 1991, the Air Force Chief of Staff banned the use of amphetamines because, in his words, Jedi Knights don't need them. The ban lasted until 1996, when a successor chief of staff reversed the policy because pilots were beginning to fly combat missions from Eastern Europe, and it was thought that they needed to have more attention. In 2002, the Air Force was dispensing 10 milligrams of amphetamines for every 4 hours of flying time for single pilot fighter missions that were longer than 8 hours. So 10 milligrams for every 4 hours of single pilot missions longer than 8 hours, and for 2 pilot bomber missions longer than 12 hours. The chief of the Air Force Surgeon General Science and Technology Division was asked, how come military pilots are permitted to use amphetamines when they're prohibited by commercial airline companies for their pilots? And he explained, quote, when a civilian gets tired, the appropriate strategy is to land, then sleep. In combat operations, when you're strapped to an ejection seat, you don't have the luxury to pull over. In 2008, the Department of Defense Scientific Advisory Group, it's called JASON, issued a report that discussed several types of biomedical enhancements, including the potential use of a class of compounds called ampakines to enhance cognition. And another JASON report in 2010 outlined an ambitious plan to employ genomic technologies, genetics, to enhance quote, health, readiness, and performance of military personnel. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, has funded a number of bioenhancement projects. Here is a list of some of them. More energy, less sleep, smarter analysis, stronger exoskeletons, augmented cognition, better digestion, and tougher bodies. Sleep is very important. One reason why amphetamines have been used so much. And in the 2008 Jason report, that body pointed out that anything that would substantially enable warfighters to function with less sleep could be a game changer. And they identified that as the primary goal or target, they thought, of enhancement technologies. By the way, the Better Digestion Project that you see on this list, this was at the Agricultural Research Service in Ames, Iowa, and they were looking for ways to enable troops to digest cellulose, so grass, tree bark, as a way of providing nutrition in extenuating circumstances when they couldn't get normal food. As we can see from the announcements from China and France, it looks like we're beginning to see a new international arms race in these enhancement technologies. And an interesting question will be whether the international community will attempt to control these military technologies, similar to, say, how it's attempted to control chemical and biological warfare. That raises an interesting question. Is biomedical enhancement a form of biological warfare such that it may be banned under the Biological and Toxic Weapons Convention? So in that box, you see the relevant language. The question is whether warfighter enhancement counts as a banned, quote, microbial or biological agent with no justification for prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes. Sounds to me like even if a biomedical enhancement is considered a microbial or biological agent, which some disagree with, it probably has prophylactic, protective, or other peaceful purposes that take it out of the prohibition in this convention, although some disagree. But I don't want to focus on the international picture. I want to focus on domestic issues. And I want to focus on this question. Under what circumstances, if any, would it be appropriate to give biomedical enhancement to U.S. troops? And under what circumstances would it be appropriate to order them to take them? So to answer these questions, we first need a set of ethical guidelines. If we were talking about civilian life, the guidelines would be those described in the Belmont report. Beneficence, respect for persons, which focuses on autonomy, and justice. Can these principles govern the use of biomedical enhancements by the military? Well, let's think about beneficence. So in civilian life, beneficence requires us to maximize the benefit to the individual and above all to do no harm. Does that fit military reality? Military service can impose a very real risk of harm on warfighters, indeed, a risk of almost certain death in certain missions. Also, beneficence in civilian life focuses on the well-being of the individual. But in the military, the well-being of the individual warfighter is not paramount. It can be sacrificed for the welfare of the state and to accomplish a mission. And above all, the welfare of the individual in the military is subordinated to the welfare of that person's comrades, in particular, their unit. A sense of how strongly warfighters feel about their obligation to their comrades can be obtained from how they relate to one member of their unit, these little fellows called packbots. They're used for surveillance. You can mount weapons like machine guns on them. They can be used to defuse bombs, explosive devices. And when a unit's packbot gets destroyed in combat, it's not unusual for the members of the unit to send condolence letters to the manufacturer and even to hold funerals for the robot, complete with a 21-gun salute. So one's comrades are paramount and overshadow the interests of the individual. On another note, a major aspect of the respect for persons principle in civilian life is that competent individuals must be given the autonomy to make decisions for themselves. But in the military, there's little autonomy. Troops, after all, have to obey lawful orders. So we need new principles for the military. In place of beneficence, we must apply a principle of proportionality. And this means that a risk may be imposed on warfighters when it is necessary, first of all. That means that there's no less risky alternative available to accomplish the objective. Secondly, when the objective is a legitimate military objective. And third, when the risk is outweighed by the benefits, including the benefit from achieving the legitimate military objective and the benefit to the warfighter and her comrades, say, from reducing the risk of injury to them. And note that the risks to third parties also must be considered, as well as the risk to those who actually use the enhancements. For example, amphetamines were blamed for the so-called Tarnak farm incident in 2004 in Afghanistan, when a US fighter bomber accidentally killed 4 Canadian ground troops, which incidentally were the first Canadian combat deaths in that war and the first Canadian combat deaths since the Korean War. So with regard to respecting persons, we need to replace the principle of autonomy with the principle of paternalism. Now, this principle is recognized in civilian bioethics as well. Respect for persons requires us to protect the interests of those who can't protect themselves because they have diminished capacity. But in the military, the need for protection isn't so much due to diminished capacity, but to warfighters' diminished freedom of action. And while in civilian life, the protectors can be physicians, family members, legal guardians, judges, so forth. In the military, paternalism, that is looking out for the interests of the troops, is the responsibility of their superiors. The third principle of military bioethics is fairness, which is analogous to the principle of justice in civilian bioethics. Now, fairness may sound like a strange principle to apply in the military in terms of exposure to risk, for example. I mean, the risk of injury or death is hardly fair. It varies depending on the branch of service, rank, location, job, and so forth. But nevertheless, fairness in military bioethics is applicable. It, for example, prohibits commanders from imposing risks on a group of subordinates in a discriminatory manner. Imposing risks on personnel who are, say, less able to bear the risks than others, for example, physically weaker members of a unit, medically compromised members, or imposing risks as a punishment for bad behavior. So now that we've identified the appropriate principles, let's see if we can apply them to military bioenhancement. The first question is, how safe does an enhancement have to be for it to be used by the military? And the answer is that it must be safe enough that the risks are proportional to the benefits, and paternalism makes it the responsibility of commanders to make this determination for their troops, not the responsibility of the troops themselves. Moreover, commanders have to take into account not only what's known about the risks and benefits of an enhancement, but also what's not known. And they have to consider how command decisions should be made in light of uncertainty. For example, there are very few studies on the safety and efficacy of long-term use of anabolic steroids by healthy individuals. Great uncertainty there. The next question is whether commanders can order troops to use enhancements rather than having to ask the troops for their consent. Now, military personnel typically are not asked for permission when they're ordered to do something, and they can't refuse a lawful order, even one that places them in physical danger. If they do resist a lawful order, they risk punishment, court-martial, and so forth. An enhancement example is the use of dexedrine by pilots. So here is an informed consent document for use by Air Force pilots. This is a little bit old. I'm sorry, Navy pilots. It's from 2000, but the principle is important to recognize. So they are asked to give their informed consent to the use of dexedrine, which is an amphetamine. But note that the informed consent document says my decision to take dexedrine is voluntary. I understand I'm not being required to take the medication. However, should I choose not to take it under circumstances where its use appears indicated, that is to their superiors, I understand safety considerations may compel my commander, upon advice of the flight surgeon, to determine whether or not I should be considered unfit to fly a given mission. So, on the one hand, yes, you are invited to give your informed consent to use dexedrine, but if you refuse informed consent, you probably won't be allowed to fly long-distance combat missions. And if you're a combat pilot, I mean, that's pretty much why what you're living for. That's what you really want to do. So, we can raise questions about just how voluntary this informed consent really is. And also, it doesn't seem like an order requiring troops to use biomedical enhancements is so different from other types of orders that a different rule needs to be applied, so long as the order is consistent with the ethical principles that I described. But there is an exception to the rule that commanders may order troops to use enhancements, and the exception is when they are conducting an experiment on human subjects. So, the rule in the military is that just like their civilian counterparts, subjects in the military must give their informed consent to participate in biomedical experiments. Indeed, there are service regulations that say that superiors, commanders, may not, quote, influence the decisions of their subordinates in this regard. For example, pressure them or promise them undue benefits. The most that they can be compensated for participation in a human subject's military trial is $25 for each blood draw that's involved. And furthermore, the commanders may not even be present in the room when the informed consent is being sought. Why do we have this rule? Why can service members refuse to be human subjects when they can't refuse lawful orders, other sorts of lawful orders? Well, because of the history of, at least in part, the historical abuses in military experimentation. And we know the Belmont Report grew out of the revelations about the U.S. Public Health Service experiments with syphilis at Tuskegee, and the same, the military's requirement of informed consent grows out in part from the military, the history of some military abuses. One was experiments with mustard lewisite gas on troops during World War II. In the late 1950s, the Army conducted LSD experiments. Note the attitudes of the two soldiers in the back who've been given LSD. And then also the atomic radiation experiments on troops in the 1950s, when large numbers of troops without consent were exposed to radiation from atomic blasts. So the rule is that they have to give informed consent to participate in an experiment. But here's the trick. Here's the problem. They don't have to give their informed consent to the use of unapproved enhancements, that is, that haven't been shown to be safe and efficacious, if they're given these enhancements during deployment to provide them with operational benefits rather than just as an experiment. And this situation arose during the Gulf War with the distribution of a chemical called pyridostigmine bromide, and also a vaccine called botulinum toxoid vaccine. Those were given to the troops to protect them against chemical and biological weapons. And also another example of deployment use is the DoD's anthrax vaccine immunization program, which began in 1998. Now, these products, the PB and BT and anthrax vaccine, don't qualify really as enhancements, although interestingly, there is actually a debate about what makes something an enhancement rather than a sort of a therapeutic agent. And if you take the position that it's something that gives you a capacity or a capability beyond what you would normally have, then you might consider a vaccine to be a biomedical enhancement. And there is that discussion in the literature. But these, as I said, these products were not given to them so much to enhance their performance as to protect them against weapons, biological and chemical weapons. These chemicals, these substances, interventions, if you will, were approved for other uses, but the FDA hadn't approved them for these purposes. PB was approved for myasthenia gravis, but not for protection against nerve agents. BT vaccine was produced by the CDC under an experimental investigational new drug exemption, but hadn't been approved. And as for the vaccine immunization program, the DoD used a newer version of a vaccine that had been approved by the FDA to protect against subcutaneous anthrax, but it hadn't been approved to protect against the aerosolized exposure, which was what the military anticipated. So in the vernacular, the military was using these products off-label, and here's the important point: troops were not asked for their permission. There was a debate about the ethics of this, and ultimately Congress stepped in and decided that troops could be required to use products for unapproved purposes that hadn't been shown to be safe and effective to the satisfaction of the FDA, only if the President of the United States issued a waiver of the need for informed consent, or the FDA granted an emergency use authorization, which you're probably familiar with because that's how come we have COVID vaccines under EUAs. And that's only during a declared national emergency. So, bottom line, from a legal standpoint, troops can be ordered to use unapproved enhancements. And from an ethical standpoint, they can be required to use them under the proper circumstances. That is, when the use is consistent with the principles that I described: proportionality, paternalism, and justice. For example, you might say that mandatory use of enhancements arguably would be justified in combat, where the welfare of the unit outweighs autonomy. Might be appropriate for troops carrying out critical missions short of being in combat. For example, the Red Ball effort to supply troops in Europe during World War II, an effort largely by Black soldiers. But depending on the risks or the unknown, the uncertainties, it might not be appropriate to require the use of enhancements by other troops, service personnel not in the front lines, and so on. Of course, in addition, mandatory use should not be mandatory for service personnel who have a likely serious medical condition. But there's still a problem with the deployment use of unapproved biomedical enhancements, and that is that deployment use is primarily intended to benefit the troops that are given the enhancements, ordered to take them, but also to see if the intervention actually does benefit them, and if so, with what adverse effects, with what risks. So in a sense, deployment use is also an experiment, and the military acknowledged this in the cases in the Gulf War. So one approach to determining enhancement safety and efficacy in real-world military applications might be to give unapproved enhancements to warfighters who face the gravest risks, such as special forces, operations forces like Navy SEALs. And an interesting sort of issue that arises here is that special operations forces are likely to be very keen to use unapproved enhancements because of their zeal and also because of their the risks that they're presented with. And so one question is whether how voluntary would their how voluntary should their permission be? Should we just order them to use it? If we invited their consent, chances are they would all consent. So it would be akin to being ordered if they're simply offered. What if the enhancement changes, say, the appearance or behavior of the service person who's taking it in a grotesque or bizarre way? I mean, I'm not sure if this is photoshopped or not, but you can look at pictures of bodybuilders who that look pretty odd. Well, pursuant to respect for persons, which is a principle that applies in the military in the form, for example, of proportionality and paternalism, this would certainly be one of the key factors for commanders to consider before they ordered the use of an enhancement. Would it have, does it have the potential for having these objectionable effects? And of course, a critical question would be whether these effects were reversible or not. Were they permanent? Another issue, of course, is rewards for superior performance. So if a service member, achieves something with the aid of a biomedical enhancement, should we think of this as most people do about the use of enhancements, aka doping in sports, which is that they really don't deserve the medal and so forth? Or should we say, well, if they're ordered to use enhancements, then it seems unfair to deprive them of the associated service benefits, especially if the enhancements that they're ordered to take create significant health risks. Indeed, the same argument might be made about voluntary enhancement use. Carryover effects in civilian life is another issue. So some members of the military live pretty much entirely in a military environment, but others, reservists, members of the National Guard, called to active duty, base personnel who live with their families, remote combatants such as drone operators who also go home to live with their families, they straddle military and civilian life. So a question is, what if the enhancement that they're being given in the military has effects that carry over into their civilian life? And this is another effect. This is another aspect, another factor, if you will, that commanders have to consider before ordering service members to use enhancements, particularly if the enhancement would make them look or act strangely. And so, remember the research that's being done in Ames, Iowa, to see if service persons can be made able to digest cellulose. And so, you can think of, the service person who's sitting at breakfast with her family, and she's reading the morning paper, and when she's finished, she begins eating it. What are the kids going to say? And what if the military enhancement gives service members advantages in civilian life, say, competition? So, they engage in sports, they belong to a bowling league, and they get certain advantages. Well, one possibility would be to require service members to disclose that they were enhanced prior to competing with civilians. But the problem with that is that this might compromise secrecy and security, military security and secrecy. Another question is, what if the enhancement benefits persist after people leave the military? Would civilians regard enhanced veterans as having an unfair advantage? Or should we say that the prospect of having advantages from enhancements post-discharge should be considered a recruiting incentive? Maybe like getting training in job skills in the military that you can then use when you return to civilian life. Finally, final question is, should warfighters be able to self-enhance? That is, should they be able to use enhancements without being ordered to and outside of a formal military enhancement program? There was a study in 2017, for example, that found that on average about 67% of active duty service members in all branches of the US military use dietary supplements such as multivitamins, multiminerals, protein amino acids, combination products, and herbal substances. And special operations forces have an even higher percentage of use of dietary supplements. What about anabolic steroids? Well, currently, the military only prohibits, quote, wrongful use of steroids, and they don't give a definition of what makes use wrongful. And furthermore, the military doesn't allow random drug testing for steroids or unit sweeps, testing a population of service members. It's interesting to consider whether these policies were adopted to protect the privacy of the troops or because steroids have known performance enhancement benefits. Don't know the history of that. Well, I hope I've given you some issues to think about. I'm going to stop here and I look forward to your questions and comments. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Mehlman. I think you can stop sharing. Great. So we have several questions in the queue. First of all, what obligations are imposed on the military for substance abuse treatment for veterans who used bioenhancements?
You mean, well, the Veterans Administration has a very broad substance abuse treatment program, education program as well, and presumably that those services would be available to veterans whose abuse was of an enhancement, if you will, steroid abuse, for example.
So why aren't military members who are subject to enormous stress and pressure, why aren't they considered vulnerable populations in the same way that pregnant women are, or prisoners, et cetera?
Yeah, officially they're not, although unofficially a number of people, including myself, have argued that they should be considered vulnerable, particularly in the sense that they don't have the autonomy to make decisions for themselves about whether or not to use enhancements, at least outside of experimental situations. In an experimental situation, in effect, they are treated as vulnerable subjects insofar as I said, there are prohibitions against them being pressured to be involved in experiments, and superiors can't be present. And historically, one of the things the military has done historically is to only experiment on volunteers. And in fact, there was a unit, I don't remember if it still exists, primarily consisting of Seventh-day Adventists who volunteered sort of as conscientious objectors, but they volunteered in the military to be subjects in military human subjects experiments. There was a question actually raised in their case about how voluntary their involvement was in that being a member of that test group, because their church very strongly urged them to do that. So that was an issue. So some people have said, look, you should have special groups of members of the military who have agreed to and are, given a special treatment of various sorts, who've agreed to serve as subjects in military medical experiments. The problem is, or one problem is, that a lot of military research is conducted outside of the military. That is, grants are given to non-military entities, universities, and so forth, to conduct military research. And there you wouldn't have that kind of control.
Why is there a consent form for dexedrine? Is it required?
It was in 2000, as I showed, for Navy pilots. And the answer is that there was a concern that it was a potentially addictive and potentially, I guess, dangerous substance. It was, it's a scheduled substance, and that people in the military should not, be forced to use it anymore. But as I pointed out, the voluntariness of their, consent, has to be called into question.
Is military disclosure of experimental efforts related to troop enhancements routine, or did the examples that you mentioned come to light for another reason?
Well, if the examples that the questioner is referring to are that list of DARPA research projects, many of them are public. Some of them are classified. DARPA, which is the primary research arm of the Defense Department, makes a determination on, whether that should be, whether they should make public what they're doing.
Do the ethical considerations change depending on whether you are drafted or a volunteer?
Yeah, good question. There is a position that some scholars take, some commentators take here, that the way to handle risks like experimental use of enhancements, deployment use, mandatory deployment use, is to disclose those risks prior to enlistment, and ask people before they enlist to agree to understand, to enlist only with the understanding that they might be exposed to those risks put into those experiments and so forth, so that if they don't wish to be exposed in that way, they can refuse to enlist. A number of us, including me, argue that that's not really very effective. It's very, very hard to imagine explaining the risks of future experimentation, future enhancement use, when we don't know what the enhancements will be or what the uses or experiments would look like. And what are we going to say? Hey, when you join the military, you could get killed. Is that okay? Does that mean that we can say you might get sick from an experiment? So I don't think that's that's an adequate alternative. Of course, as you point out, or as the questioner has in mind, it's particularly not an option if you have no choice to enlist, that is, if you're drafted.
So could you provide 3 key points that any bill regarding military biomedical enhancement should require or prohibit?
Ask the question again.
The questioner is asking for 3 key points that any legislative bill regarding military biomedical enhancements should require or prohibit. We can get back to that at the end if that's
No, well, I mean, I would refer to the 3 principles of bioethics. That the bill should permit the use of a mandatory use of enhancements, only when the use is proportional, is fair, and is appropriate from a paternalistic viewpoint. Exactly what language you would use to embody those principles in a actual law is another question, but.
Great. So many troops use marijuana and other illegal drugs. That's just a reality. What responsibility would the military have if the enhancement drugs caused an adverse event because of the use of illegal drugs?
I'm not quite clear on the point here. So you mean if troops on their own initiative use an illegal drug or say a scheduled substance for enhancement purposes? Well, the example is anabolic steroids, right? They are not approved for performance enhancement. In fact, they're in for years they were in a very unique position in drug regulation, and that is for a long time they were the only drug that a physician was not authorized to prescribe off-label. And that was before they were a controlled substance, and now they are a controlled substance, and their status as not eligible for unapproved use has been replaced by human growth hormone, which now is the only drug I'm aware of that a physician cannot prescribe for unapproved uses. And human growth hormone is an enhancement drug. People take it, particularly apparently in Florida, to prevent aging or to slow aging.
I understood the question a little differently. So assume that the commanders pretty much know that people are using marijuana and cocaine and whatever for for their own purposes, not necessarily for enhancement, and yet they provide a drug that could interact with those illegal substances. So based on their knowledge that the illegal drug consumption is happening, do they have some kind of responsibility for detrimental interactions that injure military members?
Well, I would say that, you know, that the risks that would be created by use of an enhancement that might interact adversely with something that they suspect troops might be using on the sly, if you will, would certainly be one of the considerations to be taken into account in determining whether the use of the enhancement is proportional. You know, the benefits outweigh the risks. Interestingly, as a side comment, marijuana is one of the substances that is on the prohibited list for the World Anti-Doping Association, the U.S. Olympic Association. It is considered a doping substance in sports. It has no known performance enhancement effect, at least that people think would be valuable to an athlete. Why is it on the prohibited list? This was a political quid pro quo that the White House insisted on in order to, before it would contribute funds to support the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. And it was part of the war on drugs.
Are there organizations that are dedicated to objecting to the use of enhancement chemicals? And if so, what are they?
Well, certainly in terms of, well, formal organizations, I'm not aware of. There are, you know, certainly lots of groups, I'm not sure how organized they are in the world of sports, that, you know, that is opposed to the use of performance enhancement in sports. I'm not aware of any groups that oppose the use in the military. I'm not aware that, you know, say the Veterans of Foreign Wars or the American Legion has taken a position on it. If anybody knows that, I would be very eager to hear that.
Can individuals object to enhancement use on constitutional grounds?
I am not a constitutional law expert. What would the constitutional ground be? Cruel and unusual punishment, due process?
Right, due process, maybe.
I mean, if the military uses it, you know, a process that's deemed appropriate, then I don't see what the constitutional objection would be, and why this would be any different than any other, anything else that a warfighter is ordered to do or use.
Are there ethical concerns related to deploying enhanced troops against unenhanced enemy armies?
Well, one concern is, whether is the security of the enhancement that's being used. So, for example, can it be countered or reversed or blocked by the enemy? And this comes up when, remember I mentioned that 2010 Jason set of recommendations that genetic technologies be used to enhance performance and so forth. And one concern is that there might be ways to that enemies might knowing what the genetic modifications were, or the genetic effects, might figure out ways to counteract them on the on the battlefield. Another concern might be effects on non-combatants. Which comes up, for example, with autonomous lethal robot, military robot use. In terms of fairness, is it unfair if we have bigger guns than they do, better planes? I don't see why that would be unfair. Indeed, it's ideal if you're in a fraught military situation. I don't see why enhancements would be any different.
In the philosophy literature, paternalism is prima facie justified where the protected individuals lack sufficient knowledge or appreciation of the dangers. So we have all kinds of laws about seat belts, helmets, safety goggles, and so on. And this is broader than just diminished capacity, which you mentioned. So doesn't this philosophical embracing of paternalism allow required application of the drugs and medications that you were discussing universally?
You mean, can troops be ordered to use these enhancements because similar to people being ordered punished if they don't wear seatbelts or helmets? Is that the question?
Seems
Yeah,
like a
sure,
fair
sure.
interpretation.
Yeah, that's another way of sort of describing the result of applying those three principles. That's exactly what you're doing. You're basically saying, look, we're not going to give you a choice about whether or not to use some substance that's going to enable you to function without sleep for a week, when that we deem that necessary for both your protection, the protection of your unit members, and the achievement of the mission. It's why would you? Now, you might ask the question, why would anybody refuse to take that substance? If there's a reasonable expectation of benefit to them and so forth. Well, you could ask the same question of why would somebody refuse to wear a seatbelt or refuse to wear a motorcycle helmet, or for that matter, refuse to get a COVID vaccine. So yeah, we don't give people complete freedom of choice when it comes to risks to themselves and adverse effects on other people.
Are there any military enhancements that you're particularly excited about that you would say are a great development?
Biomedical enhancement in the military is still in its infancy. At one point there was considerable excitement. Well, excitement may be a little strong about modafinil as an alertness drug in place of amphetamines because it has fewer, if any, significant side effects. I know that the British military has studied modafinil for military use, and I believe may even be routinely using it in deployments. I'm not sure what the current status of the drug is. That's the brand name is Provigil. I'm not sure what the current status of that drug is within the U.S. military, but that's one. I mentioned ampakines. There are efforts, research, particularly in the genomics field, to try to reduce the amount of myostatin in muscle, which is apparently a way of increasing muscle strength. But so far as I know, there's no deployment use of those. Caffeine, absolutely, and I think to a large extent, or to an extent at least, amphetamines are still being used.
And on the flip side, are there any that are being used that you think are particularly terrible?
Not that I know of. There is a concern with the substances that service people use on their own. For example, there are concerns with dietary supplements. From time to time, we discover that they have, hitherto undisclosed or unknown safety problems and so forth. So that's a concern, but I don't have any specific substances in mind.
All right. Well, it looks like we have reached the end of the questions. If anybody has any further questions, please pop them into the Q&A. In the meantime, I will first of all tell you that we hope that you join us for our next program that is on March 9th. It is by Professor Susan Hatters-Friedman, who is a professor in the medical school and works for UH, and is also an adjunct professor at the law school. And she has a very intriguing title, Murder in the Family, Perpetrators, Motives, and Prevention. So that is on March 9th at noon, and you will find the link to that on our Law Medicine page. Let me check and see if we have any more questions. I do have one more. What do you think are the prospects for legislation on this issue during the Biden administration with no immediate military crisis looming?
If by legislation the questionnaire means congressional action, I don't see a prospect for that, because right now I don't see a need for it. I think what is more likely, although again it may be premature, is for the services or the Department of Defense to issue policy statements, instructions, regulations, and so forth to govern this area.
Is there any action on the state level with respect to state forces at all?
Not that I'm aware of.
Okay. All right, so I will show the CLE slide, and here it is. To earn 1 CLE credit for this program, please complete the evaluation link available in the chat box or that you received with your registration confirmation email. The evaluation must be completed within 48 hours. Here is the CLE activity code. Please write it down if you're on the phone. It is 456285. 456285. Please allow 30 days for your CLE to appear. And if you have any questions, please contact Patty Harbold, and she's great at answering them. Her email address is pmk10@case.edu. Thank you again for joining us. I can actually share my screen and put this slide up for a minute so you can get the CLE activity code. There it is. And again, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you at a future program.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sharona.
Thank you.